I've stood at Hallowgate for 26 years. That's longer than most men keep a marriage, longer than some men stay alive. And in all that time, I've learned one thing they don't teach you in the drill yard. They teach you how to hold a rifle. They teach you how to stand still in the cold until your knees forget their knees. They teach you how to look through a man like he's made of glass. But they never teach you the hardest part. They never teach you what to do when the order you're given puts you between two people who both think they're right. That's the day I want to tell you about. Not the parades, not the visiting kings. The day a boy of 19 put his hand up and said no to a queen, and the whole palace held its breath. You won't find it in any record, they made sure of that, but I was there. I saw his face, and I've never forgotten it. Let me take you back. It was October. The bad kind of October, where the summer's gone but the cold hasn't decided to stay yet, so the weather just sulks. Gray skies that never quite rain. Wind that comes off the river and gets under your collar no matter how tight you button it. The leaves in the courtyard had gone brown and brittle, and the sweepers were fighting a war they were never going to win. Hallowgate sits on the north bank, you see. Big gray building, older than anybody can properly say. From the front it looks like a fortress because that's what it used to be, back when kingdoms settled their arguments with iron instead of letters. The tourists gather at the gates every morning. They come for the changing of the guard, hundreds of them sometimes. They press their faces to the railings and hold their little cameras up and wait for us to march out in our red coats and our tall black caps, and they think they're seeing something old and grand. And they are, but they're only seeing the front of it, the polished part, the part we let them see. Behind the gates it's a different thing. Behind the gates it's a working house. There are kitchens and laundries and 1,000 corridors that go nowhere, and men like me walking them at all hours, and somewhere in the middle of all that stone, there's a family trying to live a life that the whole world thinks it owns a piece of. That October, the family was grieving. I should tell you about Princess Aveline before I tell you the rest, because if you don't understand her, none of it will mean anything. She was the king's only daughter. King Havard, that is a hard man, a quiet man, the sort who'd rather lose an argument than raise his voice in it. He had 2 sons by his first wife, and then late, almost too late, he had a daughter, Aveline. And anybody who tells you a father loves all his children the same has never watched a stern man go soft over a little girl. She wasn't soft herself, mind you. That's the thing people got wrong about her. She was clever, sharp as a blade and twice as quick, with a way of looking at you that made you feel she'd already worked out what you were going to say. But she was kind with it. That's the rare part. Plenty of clever people use it like a weapon. She used it like a hand held out. I'll give you a small story because it's mine, and because it tells you everything. The first winter I served at Hallowgate, I was a young man and I made a mess of things. I won't bore you with how. A small failure, the kind that feels like the end of the world when you're 23 and you've got nothing in this life but your post. I was standing at my station near the east stair, certain I'd be sent home in disgrace by morning, doing my level best not to let my face show it. And this little girl, maybe 8 years old, comes down the stair. She stops. She looks up at me. I must have seemed enormous to her, all that red wool and the cap. And she says, "You look very sad for a man who's not allowed to look like anything at all." I didn't answer, "You don't." But she stood there a moment longer and then she said, "Whatever it is, I expect you'll do better tomorrow. Most people do." Then she went on her way. That was all. 8 years old, and she'd read me like a page and left me a little kinder than she found me. I did do better the next day, and the day after. I'd like to think I've been doing better ever since, and that a small girl on a stair is part of the reason. So when I tell you that Aveline mattered to the men who served that house, not the idea of her, the her of her, I want you to understand it wasn't the kind of thing you put in a report. It was the kind of thing you carry. She died in the spring, 23 years old. It was an illness, a fast one, the sort the doctors don't have a name for until it's too late to matter. One month she was riding in the park with that straight back of hers, and that laugh you could hear across a courtyard. The next she was thin and gray and being carried upstairs she used to run down. And then she was gone, and the whole house went so quiet you could hear the clocks. The king never spoke of it. Not once, not in my hearing. But something in him shut like a door, and it never properly opened again. Which brings me to the room. On the east side of the palace, on the second floor, down a corridor most people had no reason to walk, there was a set of rooms that had been Aveline's. Her bedroom, her sitting room, and the small room between them that she'd used as her dressing room, where her things were. Her brushes, her gowns, the little glass bottles on the table, the chair she'd sat in to have her hair done since she was old enough to sit still for it. After she died, the king gave one order about those rooms. Just one. No one enters. Not the staff, not the cleaners, not the family. Nobody. The rooms were to be left exactly as she'd left them. The door to the dressing room, the heart of it, the most private part, was to be kept shut and guarded day and night, the same as any door in the palace that protected something the king wished protected. Some men thought it strange. A guarded door with nothing behind it but a dead girl's hairbrushes. What was there to steal? What was there to threaten? But I understood it. I think most of the older men did. You don't guard a door like that against thieves. You guard it against time. Against the awful, ordinary way the world has of moving on and tidying up and folding away the things of the dead until it's as if they were never here at all. The king couldn't stop his daughter from dying, but he could stop the world from putting her brushes in a box. And so he did the only thing his grief could do. He posted a guard, and he turned his back, and he never walked that corridor again. For 6 months that door stayed shut, and nobody troubled it. The man they posted there that October was Thomas Ridley. He was 19, new. Not new to the regiment, he'd been in the ranks the better part of a year, but new to the kind of post where you stand alone in a quiet corridor with nothing to occupy you but your own thoughts and the order you've been given. Those posts are harder than people think. A man can hold himself together in front of a crowd. It's the empty hours that break you, the long stretches where there's nobody to perform for and nothing happens, and the only thing keeping you straight is the thing inside you that decided once that your word was going to mean something. I knew his father, decent man, served in the kitchens for years, so I'd kept half an eye on the boy since he joined the way you do. He was a quiet sort, serious. Not clever the way Aveline had been clever. He was a slow, careful thinker, the kind who'd turn a thing over 3 times before he trusted it. But there was something solid in him, something you could build on. And here's the part I didn't know until later, the part that matters. He'd known her, Aveline. Not well, a kitchen man's son doesn't move in a princess's world. But there'd been an afternoon, years back, when he was a boy of 12 helping carry baskets up from the kitchens, and he dropped one on the back stair. Spilled the whole thing. Bread and apples rolling everywhere and him on his knees scrabbling after them, scared half to death of the trouble he was in. And a young woman had come down the stair and knelt down beside him and helped him gather it all up. Hadn't said much, just helped. And when it was done she'd handed him the last apple and said, "There, no harm done, it's only a basket." It was only when she'd gone on her way that one of the older boys grabbed his arm and hissed at him that he just had the princess herself picking apples up off the floor for him. He never forgot it either. You can see the shape of it, can't you? He carried his small kindness the way I carried mine. And now, 7 years on, here he was, posted to guard the last private room of the only royal who'd ever knelt on a stair for him. I don't think he could have asked for the post. But I don't think there was anywhere in the whole of Hallowgate he'd rather have stood. So, October, gray morning, the tourists at the gate, the leaves dying in the courtyard, the clocks ticking through the long quiet of a house in mourning. And Thomas Ridley, 19 years old, standing his watch outside a door that hadn't opened in 6 months. He didn't know it yet, none of us did, but that quiet morning was the last quiet morning that corridor was going to have. Because somewhere on the far side of the palace, in her own grand rooms, the queen had woken up that day with a thought in her head. A small thought, the kind that seems like nothing at all when it first arrives. She'd decided she was going to go to that room. Now I have to tell you about Queen Beatrix, and I have to be fair, because for years I wasn't, and I've come to be ashamed of it. She was the king's second wife. He'd married her some years after his first queen died, and the whole kingdom had its opinions, the way the whole kingdom always does. She was younger than him. She was handsome, and she knew it, and she had a manner about her, head high, voice cool, that a lot of people read as cold. I read it as cold. Most of the staff did. We're a suspicious lot below stairs, and a new queen in an old house is always going to be watched and weighed and mostly found wanting. And she was a stepmother to Aveline. That's a hard road for any woman, stepping into a house where there's a daughter who already has a mother's memory to measure you against. The two of them had never been warm together that any of us saw, polite, careful, the kind of distance that everyone notices and nobody talks about. So when the story got out later, the easy version was the cruel one. The cold stepmother, prying at the dead girl's door, turned away by a brave young guard. That's the version that's almost true, and almost true is the most dangerous kind of wrong there is. Because here's what almost nobody knew, and what I only learned much later, sitting with an old woman who'd served the queen for 30 years and finally had a glass of wine in her, and a need to set the record straight. In Aveline's last weeks, when the house had emptied of everyone who couldn't bear to watch, and grief does that, it clears a room faster than fire, there'd been one person who sat with her. Not the king. He couldn't. He'd go in for a few minutes and come out gray and shaking and stand at the window for an hour. Not her brothers, who were grown and gone and came when they could. It was Beatrix, the cold stepmother. Night after night, in the small hours when the nurses had done what they could and the rest of the house was pretending to sleep, she sat by that bed and she held that girl's hand, and the two of them, who'd spent 10 years being careful and distant with each other, finally, at the very end, when it was far too late and exactly in time, became something close to mother and daughter. Nobody saw it. That's the thing about the kindest things people do. They mostly do them in the dark, where there's no one to give them credit for it. And there was one more thing. Right at the end, Aveline had given her something, a small thing. We'll come to it. But it had stayed in that room, and the king's order had sealed it in there, and now the queen wanted it back. Not out of greed, out of grief, out of the simple human need to hold the last thing a dying girl had pressed into your hand. She could have asked the king, but you have to understand what that house was like by then. The king couldn't speak of Aveline, couldn't hear her name without leaving the room. To go to him and say, "I want to go into her rooms," it would have been a kind of cruelty, opening a wound he was holding shut with both hands. And the two of them had grown so far apart in their separate griefs that I'm not sure she believed he'd say yes anyway. So she made a quiet decision to do a quiet thing, to go to the room herself, take the one small thing that was hers and leave. No fuss, no one the wiser. She didn't know about the boy at the door. Or rather, she knew there'd be a guard. She just never imagined, not for one moment, that a 19-year-old in a red coat would actually stop her. Why would he? She was the queen. That's where I'll leave it for now. The gray morning. The boy at the door who'd never forgotten an apple on a stair. The queen crossing the palace with grief in her chest and a thing in her mind she meant to set right. And a standing order between them, written by a broken king who only wanted the world to leave one room alone. Two good people, one door, and an order that gave neither of them any way to be right. I've thought about that morning more times than I can count, about how the worst collisions in this life aren't between good and evil. Those are easy. You know where to stand. It's when two people who both deserve your sympathy come walking toward each other from opposite ends of a corridor, and you're the one standing in the middle and you can't step aside. That was Thomas Ridley's morning. He just didn't know it yet. She came down the corridor a little after 11. I wasn't there for the start of it. I want to be honest about that, because there's a version of this story where I'm a hero too, and I'm not. I was 2 floors down, doing the rounds I'd done 10,000 times. I only came up later when it was already happening, when word had gone round the way word does in a house like that, quiet and fast, mouth to ear, something's going on by the east rooms. So part of what I'm telling you I saw, and part of it I had from Thomas himself much later when he could finally talk about it. I'll tell you which is which. This part, the beginning, is his. He heard her before he saw her. That's what he told me. The corridor by the east rooms was carpeted, a long runner, deep red, worn pale down the middle from 100 years of feet, so it wasn't footsteps he heard. It was the rest of it. The small sounds a person makes moving through a quiet space. The whisper of a skirt, a breath, the particular way the air changes when you're no longer alone. He came to attention. You don't decide to. After enough months, it's not a choice anymore, it's a reflex, the body straightening itself before the mind's caught up, heels together, eyes front, rifle at the right position. By the time she came round the corner, he was a statue, the way we're trained to be, the way the tourists love. And there she was, the Queen. He'd seen her before, of course, at a distance in processions across courtyards, but never like this. Never alone in a quiet corridor close enough to hear her breathe. She was dressed plainly for her, a dark gray day dress, no jewels to speak of, her hair done simply. Not the queen of the portraits. Just a tall woman walking a corridor with her face set the way people set their faces when they've decided to do a hard thing and don't want to lose their nerve halfway. She slowed as she came near him. He kept his eyes front. That's the discipline. You look through them, past them. You give them the courtesy of pretending you're not really a person at all, just a fixture of the house, a thing in a red coat. She stopped in front of the door. Not in front of him, in front of the door, as if he weren't there, as if the guard were as much a fixture as the door frame, something you walked past on your way to the handle. And she reached for the handle. Now, here's where I have to make you understand something about what was going through that boy's head, because the whole of it turns on it. He knew his order. No one enters. The king's own standing order given to the captain passed down to every man who took that post. Not no one except family. Not no one without good reason. No one. The order was a wall, and walls don't make exceptions. That's the whole point of them. But he also knew who she was. And there is nothing in a young guardsman, nothing in the whole of how we're made and trained and raised, that prepares him to put his body between a queen and a door she's decided to open. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to do nothing, to stand still, to let her pass and let it be someone else's problem, some senior man's problem, the king's problem. He was 19. She was the queen. The arithmetic of it was so lopsided it shouldn't even have been a question. He told me, years later, that in the half-second her hand moved toward that handle, he thought about Aveline. Not as a strategy, not as a reason he reached for to justify himself. It just came to him, unbidden, the way the dead come to you when you least expect them. He thought about a young woman kneeling on a back stair to pick up an apple for a frightened boy. He thought about the order being not really about a door at all, but about a man's last way of loving his daughter. And he thought, this is the thing he said. And I've never forgotten the way he said it, he thought. If I let this door open because I was too frightened of who she was, then I never deserved to stand here at all. So his arm came up. Not a grab, not a shove, nothing you could ever call rough. He brought his arm across flat between her hand and the handle, and he said the only words he was allowed to say. "I'm sorry, ma'am. No one's permitted to enter." She froze. I can only imagine her face because I wasn't there yet, but Thomas described it, and the maid who came round the corner a moment later described it, and the two accounts match. She froze, and then she turned and looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time, took in that he was a person and not a fixture, and on her face was the most complete astonishment. Not anger, not yet. Just the blank, stopped look of a person who has lived their whole life having doors open for them, encountering, for the first time, a door that won't. "I beg your pardon," she said. And he held the line, eyes front, arms steady. "No one's permitted to enter, ma'am, the king's order." The maid, her name was Edith. She'd worked the east rooms for years and was passing with linens. Told me the temperature of the corridor seemed to drop 10 degrees. The queen drew herself up. She was a tall woman to begin with, and when she straightened, Edith said, she seemed to fill the whole passage. "Do you know who I am?" It's the oldest line in the world. People say it when they've run out of better things to say, when their certainty's been knocked sideways, and the only thing left to do is reach for their title like a man reaching for a railing. And usually it works. Usually those 5 words are enough to make a young man in a red coat melt back against the wall and let the world's order reassert itself. Thomas said, "Yes, ma'am, you're the queen." "Then you'll stand aside." "I can't, ma'am." "I want you to sit with how hard those 2 words were. I can't." Not "I won't," he was careful, even then, not to make it a thing of his own will, a personal defiance. "I can't. As in, the order has bound my hands. As in, this isn't between you and me, ma'am, it's between you and something larger than either of us." He was 19 and frightened half to death, and he had the wit, in the worst moment of his young life, to make it about the order and not about himself. It didn't matter. To her in that moment it was the same thing. "You can't," she repeated. "Quiet now. The quiet's always worse than the shouting, isn't it? You know that if you've ever been truly in trouble. A boy in a borrowed coat, telling the Queen of Estmere where she may and may not walk in her own home. That landed. Thomas told me that one landed. Her own home, because it was, wasn't it? That was the thing that made it so hard. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't a threat. She lived under that roof. By every ordinary measure of the world she had more right to be in that corridor than he did. And here he was, a kitchen man's son, telling her no. He held it anyway. "It's the king's order, ma'am. It's not mine to set aside for anyone." "Then send for someone who can." "I will, ma'am, if you wish, but the door stays shut until they come." That's the line, you see. That's the whole of his discipline in one sentence. I'll send for help, but the door stays shut until it arrives. He'd found the one path through that didn't require him to either defy her outright or fail his post. He'd give her the senior man she was demanding. He just wouldn't give her the door while she waited for him. I came up about then. I'd had the word 2 floors down, and I came up the east stair faster than a man my age has any business taking stairs, because the message that reached me was garbled and frightened. The Queen, the east rooms. Ridley's gone and done something. And my heart was in my mouth thinking the boy had laid hands on her, that some terrible thing had happened that there'd be no walking back from. I came round the corner and I stopped dead. It was so still. That's what struck me first. After all the panic of the message, the scene itself was almost frozen. The Queen, very straight, very pale, 2 feet from the door. The boy, straighter still, his arm down at his side now but his whole body a barrier, planted in front of that handle like the doorframe had grown a man. And little Edith pressed against the far wall with her linens clutched to her chest, not daring to move, not daring to leave, caught the way you get caught when you've stumbled into something far above your station, and there's no graceful way out of it. 3 people, and not one of them moving, and the gray October light coming flat through the window at the end of the corridor. The Queen heard me and turned, and the relief on her face, I'll be honest, it stung me because I understood it. She saw an older man, a senior man, gray at the temples, 26 years of service in the set of his shoulders. She saw, at last, someone sensible, someone who'd understand, someone who would, surely, put this ridiculous boy in his place and open the door and let a grieving woman do the small thing she'd come to do. "You," she said, "you're senior here, tell him to stand aside." And there it was, my morning now, the collision I told you about, and me standing right in the middle of it, the way you always end up standing in the middle of the things you've spent your life trying to stay out of. I want to tell you I was wise. I want to tell you I saw the whole of it clearly and found the perfect words. I didn't know what I know now. I didn't know about the bedside vigils. I didn't know about the small thing Aveline had given her. All I knew standing there was the same thing Thomas knew, the order. No one enters, the king's own word. But I knew one thing the boy didn't, and it was this. I knew the king. I'd served him 26 years. I'd watched him bury a wife and then a daughter. I'd seen him in the corridors at night when he thought no one was about, an old man walking off a grief that wouldn't let him sleep. And I knew the way you know things about a man you've watched for half your life, that this order of his wasn't about rules. It was a wound. And the worst thing that could happen, the very worst, would be for that wound to be torn open in a corridor by his wife and a boy and a maid, in front of the staff, in the cold light of a gray morning, with him not even there to know it was happening. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I came to attention. I gave the queen the deepest bow I had in me, and I said, "Ma'am, the boy is right." I felt the corridor go still in a new way. "I beg your pardon," she said, the same words she'd given Thomas. The same astonishment, but doubled now, because if a boy refusing her was an outrage, a senior man refusing her was something worse. It was the order closing ranks. It was the whole house telling her no. "The standing order is the king's own, ma'am," I said, "given in his own words. No man here can set it aside, not the boy, not me, not the captain himself. There's only one person in all of Estmere who can open that door for you, and it isn't anyone wearing this coat." "And who is that?" she said, though she knew. Of course she knew. "The king, ma'am." And I watched the fight go out of her a little. Not all at once. But I watched her understand that she'd come up against something that wouldn't move for rank, because it had been put there by the only rank above her own. That there was no senior man she could appeal to, no sensible older guard who'd wave it through. That the wall went all the way up. She looked at the door. She looked at the boy. And then, and this is the part that started to turn my heart, the part where I began to suspect I'd had her wrong all those years, she didn't shout. She didn't sweep off in a fury to find someone to punish. She just stood there, and her face did something I hadn't expected. It crumpled, just for a second, just the smallest betrayal of what was underneath all that straight-backed coldness. And in that second I saw it wasn't pride that had brought her up that corridor at all. It was grief. She mastered it fast. She was good at that. A lifetime of being watched teaches you to swallow your face whole. But I'd seen it, and it changed everything I thought I was looking at. This wasn't a queen overruled. This was a woman who'd come to a door behind which there was something she needed, something that belonged to a grief nobody knew she carried, and she'd been turned away by the very loyalty that was supposed to serve her family. "There's something of mine in there," she said, quiet, almost to herself. "She gave it to me. At the end, it's mine." I didn't know what to say to that. None of us did. The three of us stood there, old guard, young guard. Frightened maid, and looked at this woman we'd all spent years deciding was cold, and none of us had the first idea what she meant. "Then we'll go to the king, ma'am," I said, gently as I could. "And you'll tell him so, and if it's yours, he'll have the door opened himself, and no one in this house will stand in your way." "He won't see me," she said. "He hasn't properly since she died." And there was something so naked in it, so far from the cool, untouchable queen of the portraits, that Edith made a small sound against the wall, and I had to look away from her face because a man can't keep his own composure looking at a thing that raw. "He'll see you for this," I said. I had no right to promise it. I didn't know if it was true. But sometimes you say the kind thing and hope to God you can make it real afterward. And it was right about then. With the four of us frozen in that gray corridor, the queen's grief out in the open, and the door still shut behind the boy, that we heard, from the far end of the passage, the one set of footsteps in all of Hallowgate that every one of us knew without turning to look. Slow, heavy, unhurried. The king was coming. Nobody had sent for him. To this day I don't know how he came to be on that corridor, the one corridor in the whole palace he'd sworn never to walk again. Edith thought a servant must have run to him despite everything. I've come to think it was something simpler and stranger than that, that a man can feel, somehow, when his grief is being disturbed, the way you feel a draft from a door you didn't know was open. That something in him had stirred and risen and carried him, almost against his will, toward the one place he couldn't bear to go. However it was, the footsteps came on, and the four of us turned, and there at the end of the corridor in the flat gray light stood King Havard. Looking at the door his daughter used to walk through. For the first time in 6 months, I have stood in front of the king 100 times, more. But I had never in 26 years been frightened of him until that moment, not because of anything he did, because of his face. You spend a life learning to read men. It's most of what the job is, really, underneath the wool and the marching. You learn the small signals, the set of a jaw, the way a hand moves, the thing behind the eyes that tells you whether a man's calm or about to stop being. And I'd read King Havard for half my life. I knew his moods the way you know weather. But the face that came down that corridor wasn't one I had a name for. It was a man walking toward a thing he'd promised himself he'd never look at again. It was a man whose feet had betrayed his heart and carried him somewhere it couldn't survive. He didn't look angry. He didn't look like a king at all. He looked like an old man who'd heard a sound in an empty house and gone to see what it was, hopping and dreading in equal measure that it might be someone he'd lost. He stopped a few feet from us. His eyes went over the whole of it, the queen, pale and undone, the boy, rigid in front of the door, little Edith pressed to the wall, me, the senior man, the one who should have kept this from ever happening. And last of all his eyes went to the door itself, Aveline's door. And they stayed there. Nobody spoke. You don't speak first to a king, and besides, not one of us had the breath for it. The only sound in that corridor was the clock at the far end, and somewhere outside and far below, faint through the old glass, the distant murmur of the tourists at the gate who hadn't the faintest idea that anything in the world was happening at all. It was the queen who broke it. Havard, she said. Just his name, not his title, and I'd never heard anyone call him that, not a servant, not a minister, nobody. It was the most intimate thing I'd ever witnessed in that house, that one word, and it told me more about the two of them than 20 years of watching had. Havard, the name a wife uses, the name nobody had dared use since the grief came down over the both of them like a fog and drove them into their separate rooms. He looked at her, and for a long moment the two of them just stood there, the king and his queen, 6 feet apart in a corridor, with a distance between them you couldn't have measured in feet at all. You came to her room, he said. His voice was rough, unused almost, the way a voice gets when a man's been carrying his words instead of saying them. I came for the locket, she said. I didn't know what she meant. I could see Thomas didn't either, but I saw what it did to the king. I saw the word go into him like something with an edge. She gave it to you, he said, not a question. At the end, the queen's voice was very steady, but it was the steadiness of a person holding something heavy and refusing to let it show. The last night, you couldn't be there, Havard. I'm not saying it to wound you, you couldn't, and I don't blame you, no man could, but I was there. I'd been there every night, and on the last one she was clear, for a little while, near the end she was clear the way they sometimes are. And she took it off her own neck and she put it in my hand and she said. She stopped. For the first time she stopped, and her hand came up to her mouth, and the cold queen of the portraits was simply gone, and what stood in her place was a woman who had sat in the dark beside a dying girl and been handed something she would carry for the rest of her life. She said, "You stayed." The queen got it out somehow. That was all, "You stayed." And she put it in my hand and closed my fingers over it. And then the nurse came, and there was everything after, and in all of it the locket went back to the room with her things, and I didn't think to take it in the days after. Who thinks of such things? And then you gave your order and the door was shut, and it's been in there ever since. 6 months. The last thing she gave me, the only thing, behind a door I'm not allowed to open. The corridor was so quiet I could hear Edith crying. Not loudly, just the small, helpless sound a person makes when they're trying their hardest not to and failing. And the king put his hand against the wall, like a man who'd been struck, like the floor had moved under him. Because he hadn't known, do you see? That was the thing none of us had understood, the thing that turned the whole morning over like a stone. He hadn't known about the nights. He'd been so deep in his own grief, so unable to be in that room, that he'd never seen the woman who'd gone in his place. He'd believed, I think we'd all believed, that his wife was cold, that she'd kept her distance from his daughter to the very end. And all along, in the dark, while he sat at his window and the rest of the house pretended to sleep, she'd been holding Aveline's hand. Every night, he said, it came out of him barely above a whisper. You were there every night. Where else would I have been? The Queen said, and it wasn't really a question, and her voice finally broke on the last of it. She was your daughter. She was, by the end, she was as good as mine. Somebody had to stay, so I stayed. I have served kings and I have buried friends, and I have stood through more grief in that house than most men see in 3 lifetimes. But I have never, before or since, seen anything like what happened next. The king crossed the corridor, and he took his wife in his arms. Not as a king. There was nothing of rank in it, nothing of the portraits or the processions or the cold, careful distance of 20 years. It was just an old man holding the only other person in the world who'd loved his daughter the way he had, the two of them finally, in a corridor, in front of the staff, letting the fog lift enough to find each other across it. He held her and she held him, and neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything left that needed saying. Thomas and Edith and I, we did the only decent thing there was to do. We looked away. You give people that, even kings, especially kings. You let them have the one private thing in a life that has so few of them. I don't know how long they stood there. A while, long enough that the clock at the end of the corridor marked it. And then the king lifted his head, and he looked at the door, and he looked, for the first time since he'd arrived, at the boy standing in front of it. Thomas had not moved. Through all of it, the Queen's confession, the king's grief, the embrace that no guardsman should ever have had to witness, Thomas had held his post. Eyes front, body planted, the door still shut behind him. He was 19 years old and he had just watched the King of Estmere weep, and he stood his watch through it like the whole thing was happening in another country. "You're the one who stopped her," the king said. "Yes, sir, no excuse in it, no appeal. Just the fact. The Queen of Estmere wished to pass, and you put your arm across the door." "Yes, sir." I saw the boy's throat move. He thought he was finished. I could see it. He thought he'd done the one unforgivable thing that, whatever the order had said, no man lays a barrier across a queen's path and keeps his post afterward. He'd made his peace with it, I think, somewhere in the last 10 minutes. He'd decided he'd done right, and that doing right was going to cost him everything, and he was going to pay it standing up straight. The king looked at him for a long, long moment. "What's your name?" "Ridley, sir, Thomas Ridley." "Ridley?" The king turned the name over. "Your father's in the kitchens." "He was, sir, yes." Something moved across the king's face. Not quite a smile. I don't think the man had a smile left in him that October, but something in the country of one. "I gave that order," he said, "so that no one would touch her things, so that the world would leave one room alone. I gave it to every man who stood that post, and in 6 months not one of them has had it tested. You're the first, the Queen herself, and you held it." "I'm sorry, sir," Thomas said, and he meant it. You could hear he meant it. "I didn't want to. I'd have given anything not to have to." "I know," the king said. "That's why you're the right man to have stood here." And then he said the thing I've carried ever since. The thing I think about when people talk about discipline as though it's a cold thing, a hard thing, a matter of rules and corners and polished boots. "Any man can follow an order he agrees with," the king said. "Any man can keep a door shut against someone he dislikes. That's nothing. That's not loyalty, it's just preference wearing loyalty's coat. He paused. You stood your post against someone you'd no wish to refuse in a cause you couldn't have understood because your word was the only thing holding it. That's the whole of it, son. That's the entire job. Most men serve their whole lives and never once have it asked of them so plainly. You had it asked at 19, and you answered right. Thomas didn't say anything. I don't think he could have. Then the king reached into his coat, and he took out a key. I hadn't known he carried it. 6 months, and the man had carried the key to his daughter's room next to his heart and never once used it. He looked at it in his palm for a moment, and then he stepped past the boy, gently, with a hand briefly on his shoulder, the only thanks a king like that knew how to give, and he put the key in the lock. And the door that hadn't opened in 6 months opened. I'll not tell you much of what was inside. It's not mine to tell, and besides, the most of it I never saw. I only caught the edge of it past the king's shoulder, and that's as much of a dead girl's private room as any man has a right to. But I'll tell you this. It was exactly as she'd left it. The light came in through the window the way it must have come in the last morning she was well enough to sit there. Her brushes on the table, a gown over the back of the chair, as though she'd only just decided not to wear it. The whole room holding its breath, 6 months long, waiting for someone to come back who never would. And on the dressing table, where it had lain all that time, a small locket on a fine chain. The king picked it up. He held it a moment, and then he turned and he crossed to the queen, and he put it into her hand the same way Aveline had closed her fingers over it with his own. She was right, he said. You stayed. That was the end of it. There wasn't any more. The two of them went into the room together, the king and the queen, and Edith and Thomas, and I drew the door not quite shut behind them and stood our separate watches in the corridor and let them have the daughter they'd both lost, in the one place she still seemed near. We never spoke of it, not properly. There was an understanding, the way there is in a house like that what had happened on the east corridor that morning was not a thing for telling, and so it never went into any record, and the cruel version, the cold stepmother turned away from the dead girl's door. That's the one that leaked out, years on, half-remembered and wholly wrong, and there was never any way to set it right without telling the part that wasn't anybody's business. So I'm telling it now, once, to you. Get the woman right at least, even if I get nothing else right. She wasn't cold. She was the one who stayed. We just never saw it because the kindest things people do, they mostly do in the dark. As for Thomas Ridley, he stood that post another year and others after it, and he made a fine guardsman better than fine. The king didn't forget him. There are ways a king has of looking after a man without ever saying he's doing it, and Thomas felt the warmth of all of them in the years that followed, and never once knew quite why, and I never told him. He earned it standing in a corridor on a gray morning, and that was enough. A man shouldn't have to be reminded of his best moment to go on deserving it. But I'll tell you the thing he said to me that night, when it was over and the two of us were standing down off our watch, and the palace had gone quiet and dark. He was shaken still, you could see it. A boy doesn't watch a king weep and refuse a queen and have it all come right in the space of one morning and then just go off to his bed like it was nothing. He stood there in the dim of the guardroom, turning his cap in his hands, and he said to me, I nearly didn't. When she reached for the handle, I nearly let her. She's the queen and I'm nobody. I nearly just stood still and let it happen. But you didn't, I said. No, he looked at his hands. I thought about the princess. About there was a time she helped me when I was a boy, picked up a basket I'd spilled. It was nothing to her, but I never forgot it. He shook his head. And I thought if she'd kneel on a stair for a kitchen boy, the least I could do was stand up straight for her door. I didn't have anything to say to that. Some things you don't improve by talking. But I've thought about it 1,000 times since. That a small kindness, given by a clever young woman to a frightened boy on a back stair, with no thought of reward and no notion it would ever matter, that it would travel all those years, quiet and unnoticed, and arrive at last in a gray October corridor, and put steel in a 19-year-old's arm at the exact moment the steel was needed. That she was, in a way, still guarding her own door, through him, years after she was gone. You never know which of your kindnesses is going to be the one that lasts. That's the thing I've come to believe, standing all those years at all those doors. You never know which small thing you do for someone and forget by supper is the thing they'll be carrying when they need it most. So you'd best be kind as often as you can, just in case. Because somewhere down the years, a door you'll never see is going to need holding. And it'll be held, or it won't, by someone you were once kind to, in a moment you've long since forgotten. That's what the boy at the door taught me. 19 years old, and he taught an old man that. I've stood at Hallowgate 26 years. I expect I'll stand here a few more, and then they'll stand me down for good, and some other old fool will walk these corridors and learn what they teach you and what they don't. But I'll carry that morning to the end of my days. The gray light, the shut door, the queen who stayed and the king who couldn't, and the boy who held the line for a kindness he'd been carrying since he was 12. A door that wouldn't open, and all the love that was waiting on the other side of it.